Every parent's worst nightmare had come true for one little girl in 1870s Arizona. At just 6 years old, Emma sat alone in the dirt, orphaned and abandoned, while an entire town walked past as if she didn't exist. But a towering Apache warrior named Kuruk saw what others refused to see. This man had buried his own children and knew the pain of loss better than anyone. He picked up this forgotten child and carried her away from a world that had given up on her. Together, they would face hostile towns, dangerous wilderness, and people who wanted them both dead. But something beautiful began to grow between them during quiet nights around their campfire. What started as one broken soul helping another became something neither expected. Can two people who have lost everything find a new family in each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days before Kuruk found her sitting in that dusty street, Emma had known what it felt like to be loved. Her mother's gentle hands had braided her golden hair each morning while humming old hymns from back east. Her father's strong arms had lifted her high into the Arizona sky, making her laugh until her sides ached. The small cabin outside Willow Creek had been filled with the warmth of a family building something beautiful in the harsh desert. But the Dawson gang changed everything. In the space of an afternoon, Emma had been collecting wildflowers behind the cabin when she heard the first gunshot. By the time she crept close enough to see, her parents lay motionless in the dirt yard. The outlaws were already inside, tearing through their meager possessions, searching for the gold her father had supposedly hidden. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. Just a family trying to make an honest living on a small homestead. The men rode away laughing, leaving destruction in their wake. Emma had waited until dark before approaching the cabin, her small hands shaking as she touched her mother's cold face. She'd pulled her mother's torn dress over the wounds, smoothing the fabric with the same care her mother had shown when tucking her into bed. That blood-stained dress now clung to Emma's small frame, the only thing she had left of home. For 3 days, she'd wandered into town, hoping someone would help. But Willow Creek was a hard place filled with harder people. Settlers kept there, heads down and their doors locked. The few who noticed a dirty, traumatized child walking their streets crossed to the other side, unwilling to take on another mouth to feed. The sheriff had glanced at her once, shrugged, and went back to his whiskey. In a territory where death visited daily, one more orphan barely registered. Meanwhile, 15 miles north in the Dragoon Mountains, Kuruk sat beside the graves of his own children. The warrior's massive frame cast long shadows across the carefully arranged stones, his weathered hands clutching a medicine pouch that held their small belongings. His wife, killed by cavalry soldiers 2 moons ago. His son and daughter, taken by the fever that followed their flight into the mountains. At 35 years old, Kuruk had become an expert in loss. The Apache name meant bear, and he'd lived up to it in battle. Standing nearly 7 feet tall with shoulders broad as an oak beam, he'd once struck fear into the hearts of soldiers and settlers alike. But grief had hollowed him out, leaving only the shell of a warrior who no longer knew his purpose. His band had moved deeper into Mexico, following Geronimo's path toward what little freedom remained. They'd asked him to come, but Kuruk couldn't leave the graves. He'd spend weeks talking to the spirits of his family, asking for guidance that never came. The medicine pouch in his hands contained everything precious from his former life: a small braid of his daughter's black hair, a carved wooden horse his son had loved, and a piece of turquoise his wife had worn on their wedding day. He'd been contemplating joining them in the spirit world when something pulled him toward town. Not hunger. He'd lost interest in food weeks ago. Not supplies. He needed nothing the white man's world could offer. Something else entirely, something he couldn't name, drew him down from the mountains toward Willow Creek. as the sun began its descent behind the desert peaks, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Kuruk emerged from the rocky outcropping that overlooked the settlement. His keen eyes took in the usual scene: merchants closing their shops, cowboys heading for the saloon, families hurrying home before full darkness fell. But then he saw something that stopped him cold. A small figure sat alone in the street, so still she might have been carved from stone. Even from a distance, he could see the defeat in her posture, the way her head hung forward as if the weight of the world rested on her narrow shoulders. As he moved closer, details became clear: golden hair matted with dust and tears, a dress that had once been white but now bore dark stains he recognized all too well, bare feet that had walked too far on rough ground. But it was her eyes that broke something inside his chest. They held the same emptiness he'd seen in his own reflection these past weeks, the look of someone who had lost everything and no longer believed in tomorrow. In this small white child, abandoned by her own people, Kuruk saw a mirror of his face. Own devastation. He understood prejudice intimately. To the settlers, he was nothing more than a savage, a threat to be eliminated or avoided. They saw his size, his Apache heritage, his warrior scars, and crossed themselves in fear. The irony wasn't lost on him that the same people who shunned this child because she was inconvenient would likely shoot him on sight for approaching her. But something deeper than logic moved his feet forward. As evening shadows grew longer, Kuruk crouched beside Emma, his massive presence blocking out the dying light. She looked up at him with eyes that held no fear, perhaps because she'd already experienced the worst that life could offer. For a long moment, they simply studied each other, two beings united by their isolation from the world around them. When he reached out his hand, palm up in invitation, she placed her small fingers against his calloused skin without hesitation. It was the first gentle touch either of them had felt in far too long. Without words, because none were needed, Kuruk lifted Emma into his arms. She weighed no more than a feather, her small body fitting easily against his broad chest. As he turned away from Willow Creek, carrying his unexpected burden toward the sanctuary of the mountains, neither of them looked back. Behind them, the town continued its evening routine, completely unaware that two lost souls had just found the beginning of something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about family, love, and the bonds that tie hearts together. Desert wind picked up Emma's torn dress, the same dress that had once represented a mother's love and now symbolized survival against impossible odds. In Kuruk's steady arms, she felt something she hadn't experienced since that terrible afternoon's safety. And in her trusting acceptance, he felt the first stirring of purpose he'd known since digging those graves in the mountains. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky as they disappeared into the wilderness. Two unlikely companions, beginning a journey that would test the very foundations of what it meant to belong to someone. In a land divided by blood and mistrust, where Apache and settler viewed each other as natural enemies, they would discover that family isn't always about sharing the same skin color or speaking the same language. Sometimes family is about two broken souls recognizing themselves in each other and choosing to heal together. Sheriff Tom Bradley discovered Emma's absence when Mrs. Henderson from the general store mentioned she hadn't seen that poor orphan child for 2 days. The realization hit him like a slap, not because he particularly cared about one more homeless waif, but because disappearing children meant questions from territorial authorities, and questions meant paperwork he couldn't afford to botch. Bradley was a man who'd built his reputation on maintaining order in Willow Creek, even if that order was more about keeping troublemakers quiet than actual justice. At 43, he'd grown comfortable with the easy corruption that kept his pockets lined and his position secure. But missing children, especially white children, had a way of drawing unwanted attention from federal marshals. "When's the last anyone saw her?" he asked Mrs. Henderson, trying to keep the irritation from his voice. 3, maybe 4 days ago. Poor little thing was just sitting in the street like she was waiting for someone to claim her. The elderly woman wrung her hands. I kept meaning to do something, but times are hard, Sheriff. We can barely feed our own. Bradley nodded, understanding the unspoken truth. Nobody wanted another mouth to feed, especially not a traumatized child with no family and no prospects. But now she was gone, and that created a different kind of problem entirely. By noon, he'd assembled a posse of 6 men, local cowboys and drifters, who were willing to ride for $1 a day and the chance to play hero. Most had never tracked anything more challenging than a lost cow, but they wore their guns with swagger and spoke loudly about their intentions. Probably wandered off into the desert, suggested Pete Morrison, a ranch hand with more enthusiasm than sense. Kids that age don't have much survival instinct. But old Miguel Santos, the town's best tracker, disagreed. No, Sheriff. I found tracks heading north toward the mountains. Small feet, but walking with purpose. And something else, large moccasins, Apache made. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Apache meant danger in the minds of most settlers, conjuring images of raids, scalping, and children carried off, never to be seen again. The fact that Emma might have been taken by Indians transformed a simple search into what felt like a rescue mission. How many of them? Bradley asked, his hand instinctively moving to his gun. Just one set of tracks. Big man, maybe 7 feet tall judging by the stride. He picked her up here in town and carried her north. Miguel's weathered face showed concern. This is strange, Sheriff. Apache don't usually come into settlements alone, and they don't take white children unless they're planning something bigger. Bradley felt the familiar knot of worry in his stomach that came whenever Apache were mentioned. The territorial government had been pressuring local law enforcement to crack down on any Indian activity, no matter how minor. A missing white child in Apache hands would require immediate action, the kind that could either make his career or end it spectacularly. Meanwhile, 15 miles north in a sheltered canyon, Kuruk had built a small fire as darkness settled over the desert. Emma sat across from him, staring into the flames with eyes that seemed older than her 6 years. They'd traveled steadily through the afternoon, following game trails that wound between towering rock formations and sparse vegetation. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the quiet of 2 people who understood that words weren't always necessary. Kuruk had spoken softly to her in Apache during their journey, his deep voice offering comfort, even when she couldn't understand the meaning. In return, she'd stopped flinching when he moved suddenly, beginning to trust in his gentle strength. As he prepared a simple meal of dried meat and wild roots he'd gather along the trail, Emma watched his every movement with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. This giant of a man, who could have easily harmed her, instead moved with careful deliberation around her, as if she were something precious that might break. Are you hungry? Kuruk asked in English, his accent thick but his words clear. It was the first time he'd spoken her language since picking her up in town. Emma nodded slowly, accepting the food he offered. As she ate, she studied his face in the firelight, the strong jaw marked by old scars, the dark eyes that held depths of sadness she recognized, the gentle way his massive hands handled even the smallest tasks. My mom is dead, she said suddenly, her first words in days. They came out as a whisper, as if speaking them aloud might make them more real than they already were. Kuruk stopped chewing, his attention focused entirely on her small face. My children too, he replied, his voice equally soft. And my wife. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition of shared loss that transcended the barriers of age, race, and language. Emma scooted closer to the fire and closer to him, seeking warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. What's your name? She asked. Kuruk, it means bear. He gestured to himself, then looked at her questioningly. "Emma, I don't know what it means." For the first time in days, something that might have been a smile touched the corners of her mouth. "It means whole," Kuruk said, though he wasn't entirely certain of the translation. Complete. As the fire burned lower, Emma found herself fighting sleep. Every time her eyes closed, she saw images of that terrible afternoon, her parents' bodies, the sound of the outlaw's laughter, the cold feeling of being utterly alone. But here, with this gentle giant keeping watch, the nightmares seemed held. At bay. "Will you stay?" she asked as her eyelids grew heavy. "I will stay," Kuruk promised, and something in his voice made her believe it completely. But even as Emma finally surrendered to exhaustion, curled up in Kuruk's spare blanket near the vase, dying fire, both of them understood that their peace was temporary. Somewhere behind them, men with guns were already following their trail, driven by fear, prejudice, and a determination to rescue a white child from what they saw as a savage kidnapper. The sheriff's badge that Tom Bradley wore carried the authority of territorial law, but it also represented a system that would never accept what Kuruk and Emma were beginning to build together. In the morning, they would wake to find themselves fugitives, not from any crime they'd committed, but from a world that couldn't comprehend that sometimes salvation comes in unexpected forms. As the last embers faded to ash, Kuruk kept his vigil, his warrior's instincts alert for the pursuit he knew would come. In his arms, a child who had known only loss was beginning to dream of something better, protected by a man who had thought his own capacity for love had died with his family. The desert night stretched endlessly around them, vast and unforgiving. But in their small circle of trust, something new was taking root, fragile as a desert flower, but already showing signs of the strength that would carry them through the trials ahead. A desert wind, steady and protective even when everything else seemed uncertain. Each morning began the same way. Emma would wake to find Kuruk already alert, scanning the horizon with eyes that missed nothing. He'd prepare their simple breakfast, while she clutched the wooden doll she'd saved from her destroyed home, the only link to her previous life that the Dawson gang hadn't destroyed. The doll's painted face had chipped and faded, but Emma held it like a talisman against the harsh reality of their existence. "Tell me about your mama," Kuruk said on their fourth morning together, his voice gentle as he handed her dried fruit and nuts. Emma looked down at the doll, smoothing its tangled yarn hair. "She used to sing while she cooked. Papa said she had the voice of an angel." Her words came slowly, each memory a careful offering. "She taught me how to braid hair and how to make johnny cakes. She said someday I'd have my own little girl to teach." Kuruk nodded, understanding the weight of such memories. "My daughter loved to sing too. Her name was Ayana. It means eternal blossom. She would sing to the birds, and they would answer her." As they walked through the morning heat, Emma began to share more fragments of her old life. She told him about her father's gentle laugh, about the way her mother would hum while hanging laundry, about the small garden they'd planted behind their cabin. In return, Kuruk shared stories of his own children, his son's curiosity about everything he encountered, his daughter's gift for finding beauty in the smallest things. These exchanges became their morning ritual, a way of keeping their lost families alive through remembrance. Emma discovered that talking about her parents didn't hurt quite as much when Kuruk listened with such careful attention. And Kuruk found that speaking of his children to someone who truly heard him began to ease the crushing weight in his chest. By the end of their first week together, Emma had learned to identify edible plants, to read the subtle signs that indicated water nearby, and to move through the landscape with something approaching Kuruk's natural stealth. More importantly, she'd begun to smile again, small expressions of tentative joy that lit up her face when she successfully completed a task or when Kuruk praised her growing skills. "You learn fast, little one," he told her as she successfully started a fire using the methods he taught her. Apache children train for years to do what you do now. The compliment made Emma glow with pride, but it also raised questions she was only beginning to formulate. "Am I Apache now?" she asked, looking down at her dust-stained dress and sun-darkened skin. Kuruk considered this carefully. "You are Emma," he said finally. "That is enough." But even as their bond deepened, the reality of pursuit never left them. On their 7th day together, Kuruk spotted dust clouds on the horizon that moved with too much purpose to be natural. He gathered their few possessions quickly, lifting Emma onto his shoulders so they could move faster through the rocky terrain. "Are they coming for us?" Emma asked, her small hands gripping his dark hair for balance. "Yes," Kuruk answered honestly. He'd learned that Emma responded better to truth than to false comfort. "But we know this land better than they do." They spent the next 2 days playing an elaborate game of hide-and-seek among the canyons and mesas, staying ahead of the posse through Kuruk's intimate knowledge of Apache trails and water sources. Emma proved to be an ideal traveling companion, light enough to carry when necessary, quiet when silence was essential, and brave enough to follow wherever he led without complaint. On the 9th day, they had their closest call yet, Sheriff Bradley's. Men had finally picked up their trail and were closing the distance faster than Kuruk had anticipated. Hidden in a cave system known only to his people, they listened to the sound of horses and voices echoing off the canyon walls below. "Tracks. And here," they heard one man say. "Either they went up into those rocks or they vanished into thin air." "Apache don't vanish," another voice replied Bradley's. Emma realized with a chill. "They just know this country better than we do. We'll have to wait them out." For 3 hours, they remained motionless in their rocky shelter while the posse set up camp directly below them. Emma pressed close to Kuruk's side, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her cheek. Even in the face of danger, his presence remained a source of calm strength. As evening approached and the searchers finally moved on, Kuruk felt Emma's small hand slip into his. "I'm not scared when you're here," she whispered. Something inside Kuruk's chest tightened, not with pain this time, but with a fierce protectiveness he hadn't felt since his own children were alive. This small girl, who had lost everything just as he had, was beginning to trust him with her very survival. The responsibility was both humbling and terrifying. That night, as they made a cold camp in a hidden canyon miles from the posse's last known position, Emma asked a question that had been building for days. "Will you always take care of me?" Kuruk looked down at her serious face, illuminated by starlight. A dozen practical concerns crowded his mind: the dangers of their situation, the uncertainty of their future, the impossibility of a white child surviving indefinitely in Apache territory. But what came out of his mouth was simpler and more honest than any of those complications. "Always," he said. Emma smiled then, the first completely unguarded expression of joy he'd seen from her. She settled against his side with the wooden doll clutched in her arms, and for the first time since her parents' death, fell asleep without nightmares. As Kuruk kept watch under the vast desert sky, he felt something shifting inside himself. A purpose beyond mere survival, beyond even his own grief. This child needed him, not just for protection, but for the kind of steady love that could help her heal from wounds that went deeper than anything physical. In caring for Emma, he was discovering that healing could flow both ways. Her trust in him was rebuilding something he'd thought was permanently broken, and her resilience in the face of loss reminded him that life could continue even after the worst imaginable tragedy. The wooden doll in her arms represented everything she'd lost, but her peaceful sleep and his protection represented something new, beginning fragile still, but growing stronger with each passing day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and the continued threat of those who would separate them. But tonight, in this hidden place, known only to the desert wind and the watching stars, They were safe, and for the first time in weeks, that felt like enough. 2 weeks into their journey, Kuruk and Emma encountered the broken arrow that would change everything. Half buried in the sand near an old battleground, its obsidian point was still sharp enough to draw blood, though the wooden shaft had weathered to silver gray. Emma spotted it first, her young eyes drawn to its dark gleam among the scattered bones of long-dead horses. "What is it?" she asked, crouching beside the artifact with the careful curiosity Kuruk had taught her. Kuruk's face grew, solemn as he lifted the arrow, turning it slowly in his massive hands. "This is from the Battle of Skeleton Canyon, 3 summers ago. Many Apache warriors died here, fighting soldiers who came to drive us from our ancestral lands." Emma watched his expression change, seeing shadows of old pain cross his features. "Were you here?" "Yes," he said simply. "I was war leader then. This arrow ... He examined the distinctive markings along its shaft. "This belonged to my brother, Nalnish. He fell defending our people's right to exist." The weight of that admission settled between them. Emma had learned enough about Kuruk in their time together to understand that his past as a warrior conflicted with the gentle protector she knew. But this broken arrow represented something deeper. The violence that had shaped his world and the losses that had driven him to isolation. That afternoon, their peaceful existence was shattered by voices calling through the canyon. But these weren't the voices of Sheriff Bradley's posse. They spoke in Apache, and their tone carried authority mixed with anger. "Kuruk, we know you are here. Come out and explain yourself." Emma felt Kuruk tense beside her, his warrior instincts awakening. For the first time since she'd known him, but instead of reaching for weapons, he placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "Stay close to me," he murmured. "These are my people, but they may not understand what we have become." 5 Apache warriors emerged from the rocks above their camp, led by a man Emma's age might have called ancient, if not for the steel in his eyes. This was Nalnish's son, Dakota, now grown to manhood and bearing the responsibility of leadership that his father's death had thrust upon him. "Brother," Dakota said, his voice carefully controlled, "we have been searching for you. The band moved south to join Geronimo, but you vanish into the desert with a white child. Explain this to me." Kuruk rose slowly, positioning himself between Emma and the other warriors. "This is Emma," he said simply. "She had no one. Like us, she has lost everything." The warriors exchanged glances, their faces showing confusion mixed with disapproval. To them, Kuruk's actions made no sense. White settlers were the enemy, the people who had killed their families, stolen their lands, and driven them into increasingly desperate circumstances. Why would one of their greatest war leaders protect a white child? "The White Eyes hunt you because of her," said another warrior, his scarred face grim. "You risk the safety of all Apache people for this. This enemy child." Emma shrank back against Kuruk's legs, understanding the hostility even without comprehending every word. But Kuruk's presence remained steady, his voice calm when he responded. "She is not my enemy. Look at her truly, look. She grieves as we grieve. She has lost parents as our children have lost parents. Pain does not recognize skin color." Dakota stepped closer, studying Emma with eyes that had seen too much violence. "You were a war leader, Kuruk. You taught us to strike fear into the hearts of our enemies. Now you play nursemaid to their offspring?" The accusation hung in the desert air like a challenge. Emma felt Kuruk's muscles tense, saw his hands clench into fists. For a moment, she feared she was about to witness the warrior everyone spoke of in whispers, the man who had earned his reputation through violence and strategic brilliance. But instead, Kuruk's voice remained steady. "I taught you to fight for our people, yes, but I never taught you to abandon the innocent. This child did not kill your father, Dakota. Men like those who hunt us now They killed your father. They killed my wife and children. They are the enemy, not her." Emma surprised everyone, including herself, by stepping forward. Her voice was small but clear as she spoke directly to Dakota. "I'm sorry about your papa," she said, her 6-year-old vocabulary struggling with concepts beyond her years. "Bad men killed my mama and papa too. Kuruk found me and keeps me safe. He's good." The simplicity of her words seemed to catch the warriors off guard. They had expected defiance or fear, not this straightforward acknowledgement of shared loss. Dakota crouched down to her eye level, seeing her clearly for the first time. "You speak truth, little one," he said finally. "But truth does not change the danger you bring to Kuruk. The white soldiers will hunt him because of you. Is his life worth yours?" Before Emma could respond, Kuruk answered for both of them. "She is worth any risk, as my own children were worth any risk, as your children will be worth any risk when you have them." The conversation that followed stretched into the evening, conducted in Apache with Emma understanding little except the emotional undercurrents. She watched Kuruk defend their bond with words instead of weapons, his passion evident even when his voice remained controlled. Finally, as stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Dakota made his decision. "You cannot return to the band, brother. Your path and ours must separate. But," he paused, looking at Emma again, "I see that your heart has found new purpose. Perhaps that is its own kind of healing." As the warriors prepared to leave, Dakota pressed something into Kuruk's hand. Small pouch of sacred herbs and a whispered blessing in the old language. Emma didn't understand the words. She recognized the solemnity of the moment. After they were gone, Emma sat close to Kuruk by their small fire, the broken arrow between them like a bridge between his past and their shared future. "Are you sad they left?" she asked. Kuruk considered this. Sad, yes, but not sorry. They must follow their path, and we must follow ours. Emma picked up the broken arrow, handling it carefully as she'd seen him do. "Will you teach me about being Apache?" The question surprised him. "You wish to learn our ways?" "I want to learn your ways," she corrected gently, "because you're teaching me who I want to be." That night, as Emma slept peacefully beside the dying fire, Kuruk held the broken arrow and thought about the paths that had led them here. His past as a warrior was part of him. It always would be. But his future lay with this brave little girl who had chosen to trust him despite every reason not to. The broken arrow reminded him that some things, once shattered, could never be made whole again. But sometimes, in the midst of brokenness, new strength could emerge. His life as a war leader was over, but his life as Emma's protector was just beginning. And perhaps, he thought as sleep finally claimed him, that was exactly as it should be. After a month in the wilderness, Emma and Kuruk had developed the easy rhythm of family. She woke each morning to find him already alert, scanning the horizon for threats that never seemed to materialize. Their days were filled with lessons that had nothing to do with books: how to read the land, how to find food where others saw only emptiness, how to move through dangerous territory without leaving traces for their pursuers. Emma had grown lean and strong, her pale skin bronzed by the desert sun, her hands capable of tasks that would have seemed impossible during her previous life. More importantly, the haunted look had faded from her eyes, replaced by the bright curiosity of a child who felt secure in her protector's care. The abandoned cavalry outpost appeared like a mirage on their 30th day together, its adobe walls still standing despite years of neglect. Kuruk approached it cautiously, his warrior's instincts alert for any sign of danger. But the fortress had been empty so long that desert creatures had claimed it as their own. "What is this place?" Emma asked as they picked their way through the rusted gates. "A place where soldiers once lived," Kuruk explained, his voice carrying old bitterness. "They built it to watch for Apache raiders, but the desert claimed it faster than they expected. Inside the compound, they discovered supplies the departing cavalry had left behind, canned goods still edible, blankets that would provide warmth, and most surprisingly, a cavalry saber lying forgotten in what had once been the commander's quarters. The weapon was still sharp, its blade reflecting the afternoon sun like a promise of violence. Emma watched Kuruk examine the saber with the careful attention he gave to anything potentially dangerous. "Did you fight soldiers like the ones who lived here?" "Yes," he answered honestly. "Many times." She was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "Did you kill them?" The directness of her question caught him off guard, but he'd learned that Emma deserved honest answers, even to difficult questions. "Yes, in battle, to protect my people." Instead of fear, Emma's face showed only thoughtful consideration. "The bad men who killed my parents, if they came back, would you kill them too?" Kuruk set the saber aside, giving her his full attention. "If they threatened you, yes. But I hope such choices never come." That evening, as they settled into the relative comfort of the abandoned barracks, their peace was shattered by voices outside the walls. But these weren't Apache voices or the familiar sounds of Sheriff Bradley's posse. These were rougher, more desperate, the voices of men who lived outside any law. "Tracks lead right here," someone said. "Fresh ones. Someone's been using this place." Emma felt Kuruk's hand on her shoulder, a silent signal to remain absolutely still. Through gaps in the adobe walls, they could see 4 men on horseback, outlaws by their appearance, armed and dangerous. Emma's breath caught as she recognized the leader's voice. It was Jack Dawson, the man who had killed her parents. "Check every building," Dawson ordered. "If there's supplies here, we're taking them. And if we find whoever's been camping here, we'll have ourselves some entertainment." Kuruk's grip on the cavalry saber tightened as the outlaws dismounted and began searching the compound. His eyes found Emma's in the dim light, seeing the terror there as she recognized her family's killer. In that moment, all his careful philosophy about avoiding violence crumbled under the weight of protective fury. The first outlaw to enter their building never had a chance to cry out. Kuruk moved like his namesake, a bear protecting its cub, and the man dropped silently to the floor. But 3 more remained outside, and the element of surprise was rapidly diminishing. "Billy?" Dawson called. "You find something in there?" When no answer came, the remaining outlaws approached more cautiously. Kuruk positioned Emma behind a pile of old equipment, his voice barely a whisper. "No matter what happens, stay hidden. Do not come out until I call for you." The battle that followed was swift and terrible. Kuruk fought with the skill of a warrior who had survived decades of conflict, but also with the desperate ferocity of a father protecting his child. The cavalry sabers sang through the air, meeting pistol shots and knife thrusts with deadly precision. Emma watched through a crack in the wall as this gentle giant, who had shown her nothing but kindness, became something else entirely, a force of nature that moved through his enemies like lightning through storm clouds. It was both terrifying and awe-inspiring to see the warrior everyone had spoken of in whispers. When silence finally fell, 3 men lay dead in the compound's dusty courtyard. Jack Dawson, wounded but alive, had managed to crawl behind a water trough, his gun trained on the door where Kuruk had disappeared. "I know you're in there, Apache," Dawson shouted, blood trickling from a gash across his forehead. "Come out and face me like a man, or I'll burn this whole place down with you in it." Emma felt something break inside her chest as she recognized the voice that had haunted her nightmares for weeks. This was the man who had laughed as her parents died, who had destroyed her world for nothing more than greed and cruelty. Without thinking, she stepped out from her hiding place. "You killed my mama and papa," she said, her 6-year-old voice carrying across the courtyard with perfect clarity. Dawson's eyes widened as he saw her, the little girl from the homestead he'd raided, somehow alive and standing in this abandoned fort. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his gun swinging toward her. "Looks like we left some business unfinished." But before he could pull the trigger, Kuruk appeared behind him like a shadow made solid. The cavalry saber flashed once in the dying light, and Jack Dawson would never threaten another family dot in the aftermath. As Emma stood looking down at the man who had murdered her parents, she felt something she hadn't expected, not satisfaction, but a deep sadness for all the violence that seemed to follow them wherever they went. "Are you hurt?" Kuruk asked, kneeling beside her with hands that had just dealt death but touched her with infinite gentleness. "No," she said, then looked up at him with eyes older than her years. "But you are." He followed her gaze to his side, where a bullet had grazed his ribs, leaving a wound that would heal, but would always remind him of this day. "It is nothing," he said, but Emma was already tearing strips from her dress to bandage the injury dot as she worked with the careful attention he taught her. Emma spoke quietly. "You were scared for me." "Yes," Kuruk admitted. "I was scared for you too," she said. "Is that what families do? Get scared for each other?" Kuruk thought about this as she finished binding his wound. "Yes, little one. That is exactly what families do." That night, they camped outside the walls of the abandoned fort, unwilling to remain where so much blood had been spilled. As Emma slept curled against his uninjured side, Kuruk stared up at the stars and contemplated the violence that had shaped both their lives. He'd tried to build their new existence around peace, around healing, around the gentle rhythms of survival and learning. But the world kept forcing violence upon them, kept demanding that he become the warrior he'd hoped to leave behind. The cavalry saber lay beside him in the dust, its blade cleaned but forever changed by the blood it had drawn. Like him, it was a weapon that had tried to find peace but had been called back to its original purpose when love demanded protection. Perhaps that was the lesson the desert was teaching them, that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the choice to fight, only for what mattered most. And Emma, sleeping trustfully in his protection, mattered more than anything else in his world. The silver cross gleamed in the morning light as Emma pulled it from beneath her torn dress, the chain catching on the fabric that had become more patches than original material. She'd worn it hidden since that terrible day, afraid that removing it might somehow sever her last connection to her mother's love. But something about the events at the abandoned fort had changed her. She was ready to share this final piece of her old life. "Mama said this would protect me," she told Kuruk as they sat beside their morning fire, the cross resting in her small palm. "She wore it every day, even when Papa said it wasn't practical for frontier life." Kuruk examined the delicate silver work with respectful fingers, noting the intricate engravings that spoke of craftsmanship from the eastern cities. "Your mother had faith in something greater than herself. That is powerful medicine." Emma tilted her head, considering his words. "Do you have faith in something?" "I believe in the spirits of my ancestors, in the sacred places where they walked, in the bond between all living things," Kuruk said carefully. "Your mother's cross and my medicine pouch carry the same power love that reaches beyond death." It was during this quiet conversation that they were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. But these riders wore different uniforms than any they'd encountered before, territorial officials with papers that would change everything. "Miss Emma Catherine McKinnon?" the lead official called as they approached the camp. "I am Marshal Robert Hayes, representing the territorial court. We've been searching for you on behalf of your legal guardians." Emma gripped the silver cross tighter, instinctively moving closer to Kuruk. "I don't have any guardians. My parents are dead." "Actually, you do," Marshal Hayes said, dismounting and approaching with what he probably thought was a reassuring smile. "Your father's brother, Thomas McKinnon, has been searching for you ever since word reached California about the tragedy. He and his wife have been appointed your legal guardians by the territorial court." The marshal produced official documents bearing impressive seals and signatures. Your uncle is a successful merchant in San Francisco. He can provide you with education, proper clothing, a comfortable home, everything a young lady needs for a bright future. Emma felt the world tilting beneath her feet. Family she'd never known existed was claiming her, offering her a life that sounded like something from the fairy tales her mother used to read. But the thought of leaving Kuruk felt like dying all over again. "I don't want to go," she said firmly. "Kuruk takes care of me. We're family now." Marshal Hayes glanced at Kuruk with barely concealed distaste. "Miss McKinnon, this gentleman may have meant well, but he cannot provide for your future. You're a white child with inheritance rights and family connections. You belong with your own people." "She belongs where she chooses to belong," Kuruk said quietly, his voice carrying undertones of barely controlled anger. That evening, after the marshal had made camp nearby to await their morning departure, Emma and Kuruk sat apart from the officials, grappling with a future that seemed to be spinning beyond their control. The Silver Cross lay between them, catching firelight like a bridge between two different worlds. "Tell me about inheritance," Emma said, struggling with the unfamiliar word. Kuruk chose his words carefully. "Your father owned land and had money saved. When parents die, those things go to their children. Your uncle wants to make sure you receive what is rightfully yours. But I don't want land or money. I want to stay with you." The simple honesty of her statement broke something inside Kuruk's chest. He'd known this moment would come eventually, had known that the world would never allow a white child to remain indefinitely with an Apache warrior. But knowing hadn't made the reality any easier to bear. Sometimes the right choice is the hardest. "Choice," he said, hating every word. "Your uncle can give you education, opportunities, a future I cannot provide." Emma was quiet for a long time, turning the Silver Cross over in her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice held a determination that surprised them both. "What if the right choice isn't about what other people think I should have? What if it's about what makes us happy?" Kuruk looked at this remarkable child who had grown so much in their weeks together. She was no longer the broken, silent waif he'd found in Willow Creek's dusty street. Emma had become something stronger, a young person beginning to understand her own mind and heart. "Your mother's people have customs about children, about family," Kuruk said slowly. "They believe blood relations are most important. My people believe that sometimes the spirits choose families that have nothing to do with blood." Emma nodded seriously. "Mama used to say that God works in mysterious ways. Maybe God wanted us to find each other." That night, as the marshals men settled into their bedrolls, Emma made a decision that would test everything she and Kuruk had built together. She slipped away from their camp and walked out into the desert, following a path only she could see. Kuruk found her an hour later, sitting on a rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley where they made their temporary home. The Silver Cross gleamed in the starlight as she held it up to the sky. "I asked Mama to help me know what to do," Emma said without turning around. "I think she answered. What did she tell you?" "She said that love isn't about keeping people with you when it might hurt them. It's about wanting what's best for them, even when it makes you sad." Emma's voice wavered slightly. "Do you think going to San Francisco would be best for me?" Kuruk sat beside her on the rocks, his massive presence somehow making the vast desert feel less overwhelming. "I think your uncle can give you things I never could: safety, education, a place in the world where you'll never have to run or hide. But would I be happy there?" It was the question that had been haunting him since the marshal's arrival. "I don't know, little one. Happiness is something you have to build for yourself, wherever you are." Emma leaned against his side, drawing comfort from his steady warmth. "Would you be happy if I stayed?" "Yes," Kuruk answered honestly. "But my happiness isn't what matters here. Your future is what matters." They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars wheel overhead. Finally, Emma spoke again, I want to meet my uncle. I want to see what kind of man he is, what kind of life he's offering." She looked up at Kuruk with eyes that seemed far too mature for her years. "But I also want you to know that no matter where I go or what I do, you'll always be my first choice for family." The next morning brought a proposal that surprised everyone. Instead of simply taking Emma to California immediately, Marshall Hayes agreed to arrange a meeting with her uncle at the territorial capital. Emma would have a chance to meet Thomas McKinnon, to see what he offered, before making any final decisions about her future. "It's highly irregular," the marshal admitted, "but the child seems unusually mature for her age. Perhaps allowing her some voice in the matter isn't unreasonable." As they prepared to travel toward what might be their final destination together, Emma carefully tucked the silver cross back beneath her dress. It had served its purpose as a bridge between her past and present, but now it would become something different, a reminder that love could take many forms, and that family was about choice as much as obligation. Kuruk packed their few belongings with hands that remained steady despite the turmoil in his heart. He'd known from the beginning that caring for Emma might require eventually letting her go. That knowledge didn't make the prospect any less painful, but it did give him the strength to support whatever decision she ultimately made. The desert had taught them both about survival, about adaptation, about finding strength in unexpected places. Now it would teach them the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes the greatest act of love is trusting someone else to make their own choices, even when those choices might break your heart. As they rode toward an uncertain future, Emma's hand found Kuruk's, and in that simple touch lay everything they'd built together: trust, love, and the kind of bond that transcends any category the world might try to impose upon it. Whatever happened next, they would face it as they'd faced everything else together, for as long as the future would allow. The trading post at Copper Springs looked like salvation after days of hard travel through increasingly barren landscape. Built where ancient springs provided reliable water, it served as a crucial way station for travelers heading toward the territorial capital. Emma pressed close to Kuruk as they approached the weathered buildings, uncertainty growing in her chest about the meeting that awaited them. Inside the main building, Marshall Hayes conducted his business with practiced efficiency, gathering information about the best routes forward and sending telegrams to confirm their arrival schedule. But it was the conversation he had with the trading post owner that changed everything. "You're escorting the McKinnon girl?" asked Pete Garrison, the grizzled proprietor who'd seen every type of frontier character pass through his establishment. "Heard there's been quite a search for her." "Our uncle's been very concerned," Marshall Hayes replied. "Thomas McKinnon is eager to provide for his brother's child." Garrison's weathered face showed confusion. "McKinnon? That's odd. Just yesterday, I had 2 men through here asking about the same girl. Said they were representing her California relatives, but their names were different. Peterson, I think. Or maybe Patterson." Something cold settled in Marshall Hayes's stomach. "Describe these men." "Well-dressed, official-looking types. Had papers and everything. Said they were bounty hunters hired by the family to track down the missing heiress." Garrison scratched his graying beard. Seemed mighty interested in how much money was involved in finding her. The marshal felt his professional instincts awakening. "Did they say anything about inheritance?" "Oh yes, went on and on about some gold mine the girl's father supposedly owned. Worth a fortune, they claimed. Said the family was desperate to get her back before claim jumpers moved in." Outside, Kuruk had been teaching Emma to identify different types of animal tracks in the dust around the trading post when they both heard raised voices from inside the building. Through the thin walls, fragments of conversation carried clearly: ... wanted posters, false documents, confidence men ... Emma looked up at Kuruk with growing alarm. Something's wrong. Before he could respond, Marshall Hayes burst through the door, his face grim with realization. "We need to talk." Now, what followed was a revelation that turned Emma's world upside down once again. The wanted poster Marshall Hayes produced from his saddlebags bore the faces of two men well-dressed, confidence artists named Frank Peterson and James Patterson, known throughout the territories for elaborate inheritance schemes. Your real uncle may not even know you're missing yet, Marshall Hayes explained, his voice tight with anger at his own deception. These men have been following our progress, probably planning to intercept us before we reach the capital. Emma studied the poster. With the careful attention, Kuruk had taught her to apply to everything potentially dangerous. The faces meant nothing to her, but the implications were terrifying. They want to steal my inheritance? She asked, struggling to understand the adult complexities of greed and deception. More than that, Kuruk said quietly, his warrior's mind already working through the tactical implications. They want to steal you, use you to claim what your father left behind, then dispose of you when you're no longer useful. The marshal nodded grimly. It's an old con game, but effective. They research families with missing heirs, forge documents, and convince local authorities they're legitimate relatives. By the time anyone realizes the truth, they've disappeared with whatever wealth was involved. Emma felt the familiar sensation of her world crumbling, but this time was different. Instead of the helpless despair she'd felt after her parents' death, she experienced a growing anger that surprised her with its intensity. So nobody really wants me, she said, her voice carefully controlled. They just want my papa's money. That's not true, Kuruk said firmly, crouching beside her. I want you. Not for money or inheritance or any other reason except that you're Emma, and you belong with people who love you. Marshall Hayes looked between them, seeing something in their interaction that made him reconsider everything he'd assumed about their relationship. The court documents were forgeries? Expertly made ones, but yes. I should have verified them more carefully before setting out. The marshal's professional pride was clearly wounded. The question now is what we do next. Emma surprised them both by standing up straighter, her chin lifting with determination that reminded Kuruk of the warrior spirit he'd seen growing in her over their weeks together. We find out how much money Papa really left, she said. And we make sure the bad men don't get it. That evening, as they made camp in a defensive position, Kuruk chose with his usual tactical precision. Emma asked the question that had been building since the revelation at the trading post. If there really is a lot of money, what should I do with it? Kuruk considered this carefully. In his culture, wealth was meant to be shared, to benefit the entire community rather than enriching individuals. But Emma lived in a different world, with different rules. What would your parents want you to do with it? Emma thought about her mother's gentle hands caring for anyone who needed help, about her father's willingness to share their modest resources with travelers in need. They'd want me to help people, good people who don't have enough. Then that's your answer. Marshall Hayes, who'd been listening to their conversation while checking his weapons, found himself increasingly impressed by both the child's wisdom and the Apache warrior's influence on her character. This wasn't the savage kidnapper he'd expected to find. This was a man who'd taken a traumatized child and helped her grow into someone remarkable. As night fell, they discussed strategy. Peterson and Patterson were closing in, probably planning to strike when they were closest to the territorial capital. The fake relatives would likely try to intercept them with forged court orders, armed backup, and a story designed to convince local authorities that they were rescuing Emma from her Apache captor. They'll paint me as the villain, Kuruk observed, without bitterness. A savage who stole a white child for his own purposes. Let them try, Emma said fiercely. I'll tell everyone the truth about who really saved me. Looking at her in the firelight, this small girl who'd grown strong enough to face down armed men, wise enough to see through adult deceptions, and brave enough to defend the people she loved, Kuruk felt something he hadn't experienced since before his own children died. Hope, not just for their immediate survival, but for the kind of future they might build together if they could navigate the dangers ahead. Emma's inheritance could provide security, but more importantly, her growing strength could ensure that no one would ever again treat her as a helpless victim to be manipulated or abandoned. The silver cross caught firelight as she touched it. Briefly, a reminder of the faith that had sustained her mother and now sustained her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were together, planning their next move as the family they'd chosen to become. The wanted poster lay beside the fire, the faces of Peterson and Patterson studying them from the crumpled paper. Soon those men would learn what happened when they threatened people under the they threatened people under the protection of a warrior who'd found new purpose in love rather than war. The Apache war lance had belonged to Kuruk's father, passed down through generations of warriors who defended their people against impossible odds. As dawn broke over their camp, Kuruk retrieved it from its hiding place among his few possessions. The morning light gleaming off the obsidian point that had drawn blood in countless battles, Emma watched with fascination as he examined the weapon with reverent hands. The lance was nearly 8 feet long, its shaft decorated with eagle feathers and sacred symbols that told the story of his lineage. "Why are you bringing that out now?" she asked, sensing the significance of the moment. "Because today we stop running," Kuruk replied simply. "Peterson and Patterson are close. I can feel them in the wind. When they come, we'll be ready." Marshal Hayes had spent the night studying maps and telegraph messages, confirming what they'd all suspected. The confidence men were indeed closing in, accompanied by hired guns and carrying forged documents that would give their claims legal weight. Unless challenged by someone with authority, they've bribed local officials in the next town, Hayes reported grimly. Sheriff Morrison is in their pocket, and they've convinced him that you're a dangerous Apache who kidnapped a white child for ransom. Emma felt anger flare in her chest, not fear, but righteous fury at the injustice being prepared. "That's not true. Truth doesn't matter when money talks louder," Hayes said. "But we have advantages they don't know about. You're clearly well cared for, intelligent, and devoted to Kuruk. Any honest person can see this isn't a kidnapping situation." As they broke camp and prepared for what might be their final day together, Emma made a request that surprised both. "Men, I want to learn to fight." Kuruk stopped securing his pack and turned to study her serious face. "Fighting is not a game, little one. It means being willing to hurt others to protect what you love." "The bad men want to hurt us," Emma replied, with 6-year-old logic. "If I can help protect us, I should learn how." What followed was an abbreviated lesson in survival that would have shocked most adults. Kuruk taught Emma how to use a knife for protection, how to identify an enemy's weak points, and most importantly, how to run and hide if the situation became too dangerous. But her most valuable weapon, they all agreed, was her voice. "You're the only one who can tell the real story," Marshal Hayes explained. "If Peterson and Patterson try to claim you're being held against your will, you need to speak up clearly and loudly enough for everyone to hear." Emma practiced her testimony as they rode toward the inevitable confrontation, her words growing stronger and more confident with each repetition. She would tell the truth about her parents' murder, about Kuruk's rescue, about the weeks of gentle care that had transformed her from a broken child into someone who could face the future with courage stopped by mid-afternoon. They'd reached Devil's Canyon, a narrow passage between towering rock walls that offered both strategic advantages and deadly risks. Kuruk chose it deliberately, knowing that the confined space would limit the number of opponents they might face simultaneously. "They'll come through here," he said, studying the canyon with tactical precision. "It's the only route to the territorial capital that doesn't add days to the journey." Emma helped him prepare their defensive position, her small hands surprisingly capable of arranging rocks and brush to create cover. The weeks in the wilderness had taught her to think like a survivor, to see potential weapons and shelter where others might see only landscape dot as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. They heard what they'd been expecting, the sound of multiple horses approaching through the canyon. But the group that emerged was larger than anticipated, and more heavily armed. Peterson and Patterson rode at the front, their expensive clothes and confident bearing marking them as men accustomed to getting their way through wealth and intimidation. Behind them came 6 hired gunmen, their faces showing the kind of casual cruelty that came from lives spent inflicting violence for money. "There she is," Peterson called out, pointing at Emma with theatrical relief. "Thank God we found you, darling. Your poor aunt has been beside herself with worry." Emma stepped out from behind their defensive position, her young voice carrying clearly across the canyon floor. "You're not my family. You're thieves who want to steal my papa's money." The confidence men exchanged glances, clearly not expecting such direct resistance from a child. Patterson tried a different approach, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Sweetheart, that savage has filled your head with lies. We're here to take you home to people who love you, to give you the life your parents would have wanted." "My parents would have wanted me to be safe and loved," Emma replied, moving closer to Kuruk's protective presence. "That's exactly what I am." Marshal Hayes stepped forward, his badge gleaming in the afternoon light. "I've seen their forged documents, gentlemen. The game is over." But Peterson wasn't finished yet. "Marshal, surely you can see this child has been brainwashed by her captor. Look at her, dirty, dressed in rags, clearly traumatized by her ordeal. She needs proper medical attention and psychological care that only her family can provide." Emma felt something snap inside her chest at the suggestion that Kuruk had harmed her. Her voice, when it came, carried a strength that surprised everyone present. "He saved my life. When everyone in town walked past me like I was nothing, he picked me up and kept me safe. He taught me how to survive, how to be strong, how to think for myself. If anyone has hurt me, it's people like you who think children are just property to be traded around." The gunmen were growing restless, hands drifting toward their weapons as the conversation dragged on. Their leader, a scarred man named Collins, finally spoke up. "Enough talk. We take the girl and deal with anyone who tries to stop us." But Kuruk had been preparing for this moment. The war lance came up in his hands with fluid grace, its obsidian point catching the light like a promise of ancient justice. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of generations of warriors. "You will not touch her." Emma reached into her dress and pulled out something that gleamed in the late afternoon sun. Not her mother's silver cross, but a small eagle feather Kuruk had given her weeks ago during one of their quiet talks around the campfire. "He gave me this when he said I was brave enough to be Apache," she announced, holding the feather high where everyone could see it. "It means I'm part of his family now, and Apache families protect each other." The significance of the moment wasn't lost on anyone present. This wasn't just about money or inheritance anymore. It was about the right of people to choose their own families, to find love in unexpected places, and to defend those bonds against anyone who would destroy them for profit. Peterson's facade finally cracked, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "Kill the Apache and take the girl. We'll sort out the paperwork later." But as the hired guns reached for their weapons, something unexpected happened. From the rocks above the canyon came the sound of Apache war cries, and suddenly the odds shifted dramatically. Dakota and his warriors had followed their trail, arriving at the perfect moment to witness Kuruk's transformation from isolated exile to protective father. The battle was about to begin, but Emma no longer felt afraid. Standing between Kuruk with his ancestral war lance and Marshal Hayes with his badge of lawful authority, holding an eagle feather that marked her as someone worth fighting for, She finally understood what family really meant. It wasn't about blood or paperwork or legal guardianship. It was about people who would risk everything to keep you safe, who saw your worth when the world dismissed you, who helped you become strong enough to face whatever came next. The sun was setting behind the canyon walls, painting everything in shades of red and gold, as two worlds prepared to clash over the future of one small girl who'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing love over safety, truth over convenience, and family over everything else. The eagle feather in Emma's hand seemed to catch fire in the dying sunlight as the first shots rang out across Devil's Canyon. But instead of chaos, what followed was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of tactical superiority that showcased everything Kuruk had learned during decades of warfare. The hired gunmen had expected to face one Apache warrior, one territorial marshal, and a helpless child. Instead, they found themselves caught in the crossfire between Kuruk's position on the canyon floor and Dakota's warriors positioned on the rocky ledges above. The narrow passage that had seemed like an advantage suddenly became a trap. Emma pressed herself against the rock wall where Kuruk had positioned her, watching in amazement as the man who taught her to gather berries and braid grass transformed into something from Apache legend. The war lance moved in his hands like a living thing, deflecting bullets and striking with precision that spoke of lifelong training. "Stay down and stay quiet," Marshal Hayes called to her as he took cover behind a boulder, his rifle answering. The gunmen's fire with steady accuracy. "Let us handle this." But Emma wasn't content to simply hide. Her weeks in the wilderness had taught her to think strategically, and she could see something the adults had missed. Peterson and Patterson had taken cover behind their horses near the canyon entrance, but they were slowly working their way toward a side passage that would allow them to escape while their hired guns provided distraction. "They're getting away," she called out, pointing toward the Confidence men's retreat. Kuruk's eyes followed her gesture, confirming what his own tactical instincts had been warning him about. In the heat of battle, the real enemy was slipping away, leaving their hired violence to cover their escape. Without hesitation, he made a decision that demonstrated the complete trust that had grown between them. "Emma, can you reach Marshal Hayes?" "Yes. Tell him about the side passage." The real criminals must not escape. Emma darted between rocks with the stealth Kuruk had taught her, reaching the marshal's position just as he was reloading his rifle. Her message was brief, but clear, and Hayes immediately understood the tactical situation. "Cover me," he called to Kuruk, then sprinted toward the passage where Peterson and Patterson were making their escape. What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse among the canyon's rocky terrain. The remaining gunmen, realizing their employers had abandoned them, began to lose the coordinated discipline that had made them dangerous. Dakota's warriors took advantage of their confusion, using traditional Apache tactics to outmaneuver opponents who relied too heavily on superior firepower. Emma watched from her protected position as Collins, the scarred leader of the hired guns, tried to reach her hiding place. But Kuruk was there first, the war lance intercepting the man's advance with a display of fighting skill that belonged to another era. "You should have taken the money and walked away," Collins snarled as he drew, his knife facing Kuruk in close combat. "Some things are worth more than money," Kuruk replied, his voice calm despite the deadly dance they were engaged in. The fight was brief but decisive. Collins had the desperation of a man with nothing to lose, but Kuruk had something far more powerful, the protective love of a father defending his child. When it ended, Collins lay motionless in the dust, and Kuruk stood over him with the war lance still steady in his hands. From the side passage came the sound of Marshal Hayes' voice raised in authority. "Frank Peterson and James Patterson, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted kidnapping." The two Confidence men emerged with their hands raised, their expensive clothes torn and dusty from their failed escape attempt. Behind them walked Marshal Hayes, his badge gleaming with the satisfaction of justice properly served. "It's over," Dakota called down from the rocks above, where the last of the hired guns had surrendered rather than face Apache warriors in their natural element. Emma stepped out from her hiding place, the eagle feather still clutched in her small fist. As she looked around the canyon at the aftermath of violence, she felt not triumph, but a deep sadness for the necessity of what had just occurred. "Are they all alive?" she asked Kuruk as he approached, the war lance now resting peacefully at his side. "Most of them. The ones who chose surrender over stubbornness." He knelt beside her, checking for any signs of injury or trauma. "How do you feel, little one?" Emma considered this carefully. "Sad that people wanted to hurt us. Happy that we're safe. Proud that we fought for each other." Kuruk smiled, recognizing the wisdom that had been growing in her throughout their journey. "Together. Those are good feelings to have. They show you understand what family means." As the sun finally disappeared behind the canyon walls, Dakota approached them with something Emma had never seen before: acceptance and respect in his eyes when he looked at her. "The child fought with courage," he said to Kuruk in Apache, then switched to English for Emma's benefit. "She warned you about the escape route. A true warrior notices what others miss." Emma straightened with pride at the compliment, but her attention was drawn to Marshal Hayes as he secured the prisoners and began the process of sorting through the forged documents and stolen goods they carried. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now, we find out the truth about your inheritance," Hayes replied. "And we make sure these men face justice for what they've done." As night settled over Devil's Canyon, they made camp among the rocks where the battle had been fought. The prisoners were secured under guard, the wounded were tended, and for the first time in weeks, Emma felt the possibility of a future that didn't involve constant flight from danger, but questions remained. Peterson and Patterson's elaborate scheme suggested that her father's legacy was indeed substantial enough to justify murder, fraud, and the hiring of armed men. Tomorrow would bring answers about what Thomas McKinnon had really left behind, and what that meant for a 6-year-old girl who'd learned to value love over wealth. The eagle feather lay beside her as she prepared for sleep, its symbolism now proven in battle. She was Apache by choice and love, McKinnon by blood and inheritance. Tomorrow would test whether the world could accept someone who belonged to both cultures, or whether she'd have to choose between the family she'd found and the legacy she'd inherited. The sacred stone Kuruk pulled from his medicine pouch had been worn smooth by generations of Apache hands, its surface marked with symbols that told stories older than memory. As dawn broke over Devil's Canyon, he placed it in Emma's palm with the solemnity of ceremony. "This belonged to my grandfather's grandfather," he told her quietly while the camp around them stirred to life. "It has been passed down only to true family members. Today, it becomes yours." Emma felt the weight of the stone, not just its physical presence, but the history it carried, the love it represented, the permanent bond it symbolized. What does this mean? It means that no matter what papers say, no matter what courts decide, you are my daughter in the eyes of my ancestors. Nothing can change that. Their quiet moment was interrupted by Marshal Hayes, who approached with documents he'd spent the night examining by firelight. His expression was grim but determined. "I've been going through Peterson and Patterson's papers," he said. "The real story is worse than we thought. Your father didn't just own a small homestead, Emma. He discovered a significant gold deposit on his land just before he died. The claim alone is worth more than most people see in a lifetime." Emma looked up from the sacred stone, trying to understand what this meant. So the bad men wanted to steal from Papa? More than that. They killed your parents specifically to get access to the mine. The Dawson gang wasn't just raiding randomly. They were hired to eliminate your family so Peterson and Patterson could claim the inheritance through forged documents. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Emma's parents hadn't died because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. They'd been murdered as part of an elaborate scheme to steal their child's future. But before she could fully process this information, new danger announced itself. Sheriff Morrison and a posse of 12 men appeared at the canyon entrance, their badges gleaming but their intentions clearly corrupt. "Marshal Hayes," Morrison called out, "I have warrants for the arrest of that Apache kidnapper and anyone helping him resist lawful authority." Hayes stepped forward, his own badge prominently displayed. "Those warrants are based on forged documents, Sheriff. I have the real criminals in custody right here." But Morrison wasn't interested in truth. The money Peterson and Patterson had paid him was already spent, and his reputation depended on completing the job he'd been hired to do. "I see an Apache warrior holding a white child against her will," Morrison declared loudly. "Looks like kidnapping to me." Emma felt anger flare inside her chest, not fear, but righteous fury at the corruption and stupidity of adults who refused to see what was right in front of them. She stepped forward, the sacred stone clutched in one hand and the eagle feather in the other. "I'm not being held against my will," she shouted, her young voice carrying clearly across the canyon. "I'm with my family. Kuruk saved me when everyone else walked away." Sheriff Morrison sneered. "Child, you've obviously been brainwashed by this savage. We're here to rescue you and return you to civilization where you belong." That was the moment Emma's transformation became complete. Standing between the two men who represented her chosen and legal protectors, facing down corrupt officials who saw her only as property to be claimed, she found her voice. "I know exactly where I belong," she said, her words ringing with absolute certainty. "I belong with people who love me, not people who want to use me. I belong with someone who taught me to be strong, not someone who thinks I'm weak. I belong with Kuruk, and if you try to take me away from him, you'll have to fight me too." The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. Morrison's men had expected to face a single Apache warrior and were unprepared for Dakota's warriors. Marshal Hayes' authority, and most surprising of all, the fierce resistance of the small girl they'd come to rescue. When the corrupt sheriff tried to grab Emma, she bit his hand hard enough to draw blood and darted away with the speed and agility Kuruk had taught her. When his men tried to surround Kuruk, they found themselves facing not just the warlance, but the coordinated resistance of people who'd learned to function as a true family. The battle was over almost before it began. Faced with legitimate federal authority, witnesses to their corruption, and clear evidence of their criminal involvement, Morrison's posse melted away like desert snow. The sheriff himself ended up in custody alongside Peterson and Patterson. His career in law enforcement permanently ended as dust settled over the canyon floor. Emma stood in the center of it all, with the sacred stone and eagle feather raised. High symbols of the two worlds she'd learned to bridge. The two families that had shaped her into someone stronger than anyone could have imagined. "Is it over?" she asked Kuruk as he approached, the war lance once again resting peacefully at his side. "This part is over," he replied, kneeling to her eye level. "But our story is just beginning." Marshal Hayes approached with official documents, real ones this time, bearing authentic seals and signatures. "There's going to be a hearing at the territorial capital," he explained, "to determine Emma's legal guardianship and to sort out her inheritance. But after what I've witnessed here, I think the outcome is going to surprise a lot of people." Emma smiled, feeling the sacred stone warm in her palm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but today had proven something important. Family wasn't about what people expected or what society demanded. It was about people choosing to love and protect each other, no matter what the world threw against them. The sun climbed higher over Devil's Canyon, illuminating a scene that would be talked about for years to come the day a 6-year-old girl and an Apache warrior proved that love could triumph over greed, that courage could overcome corruption, and that family was whatever you chose to make it. 6 months after the battle at Devil's Canyon, Emma stood beside Kuruk in the main street of Willow Creek. But this time, everything was different. The dusty settlement that had once ignored a desperate child now buzzed with respectful attention as the photographer from the territorial newspaper adjusted his equipment for the formal portrait that would commemorate their legal victory. The Asta family portrait would show Emma in a new dress, still practical for frontier life, but clean and well-fitted, standing beside Kuruk, who wore both traditional Apache clothing and the silver badge that designated him as her official guardian. Under territorial law, it was an image that challenged every assumption the region had held about family, citizenship, and belonging. The hearing at the territorial capital had drawn crowds and newspaper coverage from as far away as San Francisco. Judge Harrison, known for his practical wisdom and adherence to law over prejudice, had listened to testimony from dozens of witnesses before making his unprecedented ruling. "The evidence is clear," he had declared from the bench. Emma McKinnon was abandoned by this community and rescued by Kuruk, who has provided exemplary care for 6 months. Furthermore, the child herself has repeatedly and eloquently expressed her preference for remaining with her chosen guardian. This court recognizes Kuruk as Emma's legal guardian, with all rights and responsibilities thereof. The decision had sent shockwaves through territorial society, but it had also opened doors that Emma was determined to walk through. Her inheritance from the gold mine was substantial more money than most families saw in several lifetimes. But Emma had learned the difference between wealth and worth during her time in the wilderness, and she knew exactly what she wanted to do with her unexpected fortune. The first change was visible throughout Willow Creek. Emma had used part of her inheritance to establish a school that served both Apache and settler children, teaching them together in the same classroom. Miss Rebecca Thompson, a teacher from back east who believed in progressive education, had been hired to run the school with assistance from Apache elders who taught traditional skills and wisdom. Learning should bring people together, not keep them apart, Emma had explained to the school board, her 8-year-old voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen the cost of prejudice firsthand. The second change was more personal. Kuruk and Emma had built a home in the hidden valley where they'd once taken shelter, but now it was a permanent settlement with a well, gardens, and guest quarters for the steady stream of visitors who came to see the unlikely family that had captured the territory's imagination. But perhaps the most significant change was in the people themselves. Sheriff Bradley, shamed by his earlier indifference, had become one of Emma's strongest supporters. Mrs. Henderson from the general store now served on the school board and often spoke of how Emma's courage had taught the whole town about the importance of helping those in need. As the photographer prepared to take their portrait, Emma felt the weight of the sacred stone in her pocket, the same stone Kuruk had given her during their final battle, now polished smooth by constant handling. Beside, it was her mother's silver cross, the two artifacts representing the dual heritage she'd learned to embrace. "Are you ready?" the photographer asked, his voice respectful in a way that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. Emma looked up at Kuruk, seeing in his dark eyes the same steady love that had sustained her through the darkest period of her life. His massive frame was still imposing, but now it carried the authority of legal recognition rather than the isolation of an outcast. "We're ready," she said, speaking for both of them as she'd learned to do. The photograph, when it appeared in newspapers throughout the territory, showed more than just an Apache warrior and his adopted daughter. It showed the future, a vision of what America could become when people chose love over fear, understanding over prejudice, and family over the artificial barriers that had divided communities for too long. That evening, as they sat by the fire in their valley home, Emma asked the question that had been growing in her mind for weeks. Do you think Mama and Papa would be proud of who I've become? Kuruk considered this with the careful attention he gave to all her important questions. I think they would be amazed by your strength, proud of your choices, and grateful that you found people who could help you grow into everything you were meant to be. Emma nodded, satisfied with this answer. Around them, the desert wind carried the sounds of a world that was slowly learning to change children's voices from the integrated school. The sound of Apache and settler families working together on community projects. The quiet conversations of people who discovered that their similarities far outnumbered their differences. 6 months ago, Emma had been a broken child, sitting alone in the dust, while an entire town walked past her suffering. Tonight, she was a young lady with purpose, wealth, and most importantly, a family that had chosen her just as she'd chosen them. Her inheritance had given her financial security, but her real wealth lay in the love that surrounded her and the knowledge that she could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The sacred stone and silver cross in her pocket reminded her daily that identity wasn't about choosing between different parts of herself. It was about embracing all of who she was and using that wholeness to make the world a little better for everyone around her. As stars appeared in the desert sky above their valley, Emma fell asleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to learn, to grow, and to prove that the bonds of chosen family were strong enough to overcome any obstacle. In Kuruk's protective presence, she'd found not just safety, but the courage to become exactly who she was meant to be. And in the morning, she would wake up in a world that was slowly learning to see that families come in all shapes and sizes, that love transcends any boundary society might try to impose, and that sometimes the most unlikely people become the most important parts of our stories. The photograph would preserve this moment. Forever, two souls who'd found each other in the wilderness and built something beautiful from the broken pieces of their separate tragedies. It was a portrait of hope, of healing, and of the kind of love that changes everything it touches. Emma McKinnon and Kuruk, father and daughter by choice, family by love, and proof that sometimes the best endings are really just the beginning of something even more wonderful.